First of all, thanks so much. Thanks to the Serpentine and Alex, and I'm really excited to be here. There's a fantastic lineup, as I'm sure you all know. So, it's kind of scary to open up, huh? So, what I wanted to do, just before I kind of delve in and talk to you about the project a little bit more, was to tell you that we've been asked to bring in an object that represents the project for us. And I've actually decided to make an object with you here today. So you would have found a pen and a piece of paper, or there should be one around somewhere. So follow me if you will. The idea is to sort of draw a little circle in the middle of your page. It's going to be like really infantilizing. And try to put yourself in that circle, right? Write me or your name or whatever you like that represents you, the image of something. And then maybe draw a little few arrows that like point in towards you. Don't we all like that? Attention. And then a few circles that sort of radiate out, so kind of concentric circles around that central circle of you. The idea is to spend 30 seconds or so thinking about what sustains you. So right in those circles around that central circle around you, what cares for you? What or who? It could be, I don't know, Allah, a tree, your mom, a friend, a TV show, whatever it is that sustains you. Because we're not all individual units, but obviously we exist through connection and through this network of support. So it's, to me, one thing that's really interesting and one thing that I brought to deportment was to sort of try to visualize that, right? So once you've done that, I'm going to leave you to it for a few more seconds. 5 or 6 things or 100 things, whatever you like. What supports you? Who or what? Or it could be a concept, could be a person. What supports you? The idea, once you've sort of done that, is to now flip the page over and write me at the center again. And then this time draw arrows pointing outwards and draw concentric circles just as you have on the front of the page. And this time write what you support or what you care for. So this time, instead of writing what cares about you, with increasing intensity as you come to the middle, we're writing what you care for, what you sustain, what you support. Concept, person, whatever it is that you support. With increasing intensity, so our care has a certain potency and it changes over time. So what you care for today might not be what you care for a year from now. But what do you support? It could be air, a tree. I always like trees. People, or a parent, I don't know, sister, brother. I know this is very short, so it would be fun to do it for a really long time. Has anyone found like any overlaps, like the same person or concept on both sides of the sheet? Yeah? A few people? Yeah. So to me, what's interesting about this exercise, and I'd love to have time to open up the conversation and talk about it, I don't know if we do have time to do that right now, is that you'll notice the differential ways in which care is spread, in which your own personal care network is sort of different. The ways you give out care and receive care, maybe even through the same concept or thing, the potency of that is differential. And something that I really wanted to focus on when I started working with deportment was to really think about that. So how is our identity or the ways in which we exist within a society, how does it make us a sort of subject that receives care in a very specific way? So from a state level, that might mean that the ways in which policies are made will affect us and the ways in which we have the resources for care in very different ways. So if we think about care as a resource, and a differential resource at that, then we begin to understand care as a really complex system, but it always exists. It is a preeminent kind of glue in some ways. So now to kind of jump into what I started doing with the Portman was when I got there, I'm being interested in doing theater work, theater of the oppressed. I strongly suggest you go to a workshop tomorrow. It's going to be amazing. So what I tried to do is to think about these things, care, do these sort of diagrams with the staff and the mothers at Portman. And what we started thinking about was that things like certain policies, like the 30-hour free childcare policy, which is now active. People used to get 15 hours of free childcare, now they get 30 hours. Sounds amazing, except for the economic resources for that policy are not really available. And so the brunt of that cost really falls on the nurseries, the institutions, the early childhood centers. And it means that there are less resources available for more children for more time. So in that sense, when I was talking to the staff of the Portman, which was a really interesting experience in that way, you really do realize that even policies that seem to say, hey, there are more resources available, we're allocating more resources for care, are actually in effect hiding something a lot darker, which is that the private sector is being essentially helped and benefits from these policies that were technically there to support public sector early childhood centers. So in some ways, the experience of childhood is becoming more and more differentiated. It is the kind of scissor, let's say, it's sort of spreading between what is offered to children who go to a public or private sector. And living in the US for a long time, it's really obvious there what the effects are. So when I was working with the Portman, we were working on theater, and we decided to use theater as a way to write a children's book on these questions. To do that, I started collecting sort of drawing scenes that we were coming up with during the theater sessions at Portman around these policy questions, around the lack of resources, and then to sort of bring the drawings back into the room week after week and make them into theater again. So bring the drawings in, kind of act out the scene that we've been discussing, develop the narrative for the book, go back home, draw it, bring it back in. So that kind of process was really interesting in writing a children's book, and writing a children's book about political questions. So something I really love about the arts, the capacity for art institutions to work with spaces like this, is that we can bring in things that are generally, let's say, maybe undesirable, or things that we wouldn't really be allowed to do, which is like talk about cuts to 7-year-olds, and develop tools to do that. And not to quote unquote be neutral, because obviously that's not possible, but to really try to think about what political ideologies are doing in public sectors, and specifically neoliberalism in this case. So that's something that I think is really important, and I'm sure Joe will have a lot more to say about the actual effects of cuts and the specific policies that are being put into place. So I've got notes on like 3 different devices here, so bear with me. So I think that one thing that's going to be sort of evident in the book when it gets published, we're sort of in the works still, is that through a partnership like this, objects and tools that are to some degree radical can exist, but at the same time we always have to remember that we carry an institutional agenda, whether we know it, whether we are aware of it, whether we want to or not. And that institutional agenda needs to be sort of questioned and thought through. So on the one hand, it allows for radicality, for things like these tools to exist and come into being. On the other hand, institutions do have an agenda, and we live under that umbrella, and what that means for the radicality of a project is really important, I think. Another thing I wanted to touch on is a couple of examples that I thought about in thinking about the sort of rights to city question. So on the one hand, one example I wanted to bring to the table really briefly was an ordinance called Ordinance 446 in Naples. It was made possible by the current mayor, De Magistris, who in 2011 started giving space for free to those who had been squatting the space. So completely contrary to what's happened here. Here since 2012, there's been a criminalization of squatting. In Naples, actually, spaces that have been squatted, and have been squatted for a long time, have actually been given over to the people who are self-managing them. These spaces have also opened up early childhood centers. So that's an interesting twist to think about how a sort of right to the city can manifest itself locally through a mayoral kind of initiative and become a sort of a possibility for people to actually run spaces by themselves and not feel under threat or feel criminalized for doing that kind of work. So I strongly suggest looking into that ordinance. It's quite interesting as a legal document. Another example I wanted to bring up, which hopefully somebody else will talk about, is the right to the city in Brazil, which is a constitutional change led mainly by people coming out of Puerto Alegre in the 90s, and in 2001, Articles 84 and 85, I can't remember, 80 something of the Brazilian constitution were changed to reflect a right to the city, which meant essentially that a ministry for cities would be set up, and that essentially, and I think this is the real radical nature of this specific change, is that the social value of space was going to always have preeminence over the commercial value of space. So this has actually become enshrined in the Brazilian constitution. It's led to a million different complications, as you can imagine. The market obviously has its own specific powers to deal with these kinds of things. But I think it's really interesting, and I think it's the only example I can think of where an actual constitutional change has elected to protect public space from the law of the market, essentially. So one of the last things I wanted to touch on was that I also think we should really deeply think about what it means to engage with a rights approach. There's an amazing paper by, I'm not going to say this right, Aitan Gandongtu, who's a researcher, and the paper is called The Right to Have Rights. So the idea is obviously that rights aren't a sort of given thing, they're acquired, and they're usually acquired by citizens. So there are so many people that fall outside of that spectrum. And I think that it's really important to remember how to have a right, you have to become visible, and how dangerous that is for a lot of people. So in order to be able to claim that, you really have to be privileged already to some degree. So I think when we think about a right to the city, we might even want to think about a different pathway. And so in sort of conclusion, what I've been really thinking about and what kind of came through this collaboration was the idea that care in some way shouldn't be a right. Care should be a common. Care is a common, already exists as a common. It exists because as we kind of worked through this morning a few minutes ago, we all have these networks of care that exist, pre-exist us, that have been ongoing since humanity's inception. Care has always kind of sustained us, and it's one of those values and one of those core kind of systems that allows us to sustain life. And so the fact that it exists and it can be visualized, can be rendered visible, I think is a really interesting way to think about care and cities, and maybe kind of drift away from the rights approach, in my opinion. But didn't want to start off dismantling everything. So I think that's more or less everything I had on my crazy notes. The last thing, I guess, just in conclusion, would be to do one last kind of mental exercise maybe, which is to kind of try to define independence in your head, whatever kind of comes to mind. What kind of words do you associate with the word independence? And then once you've kind of done that mentally, to think about the word dependence. and what kind of things come to mind when you think about the word dependence. And then finally, to try to define the word isolation, and think about in which ways isolation is more kind of connected to the first word you defined, which is independence, which in this society has a hugely positive connotation. But yeah, I'd just like to leave you with that thought. It's much more complex, I guess. Thank you.
Great, thank you for starting us off. I'm going to welcome to the stage now Bahbak Hashemi-Nezhad. If you'd like to join us, I'll pass over to you.
Yeah, I think it's lovely. That's why I asked you. Yeah.
At first I was like, Anne. I was like, you know what?
Yeah.
They all know about it.
So we do it, yeah?
The exhibitions are invited.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. I'm going to do a very quick introduction and then present the process of my residency and some of the outcomes to date. The residency, Changing Play in collaboration with Serpentine Education and Portman Center, started with a very big question of how the public realm can become a site for early child development, basically. It was a very huge question, and through the kind of resources of the center, Portman, I was able to exercise this in a much more focused way. So with this question, I also became interested in the idea of the public realm as remaining both immediate and accessible. With this in mind, we started to devise the project over four stages, over 10 weeks. And so the idea was to initially look at the public realm or the locality of the center as an extension of the center. So we identified a space called Portman House, which is just off Edgware Road. And it's a 21-story housing block with a very kind of vast space beneath it, a kind of underdeveloped space, which has kind of evaded all sorts of development policies over the last 40 years, a kind of symptomatic view of the city somehow, something we see elsewhere as well. So yeah, this particular space is within walking distance of the Portman, and what's important is that it's also within walking distance of the Portman for 3-year-old legs, because every week, over 10 weeks, we walk there with a group of 7 3- to 4-year-old students, or children, sorry, members from the Portman and members from myself and members from the education team in the Serpentine. So initially, the idea was to just engage with the space, just with the architectural and the natural elements. So without introducing anything, we allowed the children to play in this kind of grand space, these open spaces, these vantage points, articulations, gardens, and so on. And it was really, the first 2 weeks in particular were purely observational. It was just beginning to understand this response from the child or the children. And slowly, I began to think about introducing some parts to support what I saw, basically. So what I was observing were both narratives which were created by the children, but also affordances, things that we no longer may perceive, whether they're being physical or otherwise. And these open parts, or these introduced elements, were, so I set a very kind of strict rule for myself that these have to be readily available, they have to be cheap, and I will allow myself to rethink them each week and devise new, more relevant pieces each time. So between the center and Portman House was Leyland's, you may know. It's a kind of famous warehouse or hardware shop. And that's where most of the elements came from. So the idea being that what I introduced may also be introduced by others, and they can also obtain that with little cost and it being accessible. And yeah, so from that point, and these parts were, I mean, I can just tell you what they were. They changed a lot over the 10 weeks, but they ended up being rope, planks of wood, debris mesh, which is used for construction, pipes, dust sheets, stuff like that. And I think what's important here is that each week that we went there, we also were confronted with different natural elements. So, you know, if you have sun and shadows, one week we had extreme wind, rain, and these elements were also responsive to these natural elements, these loose parts or these introductions. And what also became quite interesting was each week when we went there, we were reminded by the kind passing crowd that there is a perfectly good playground just around the corner. And, you know, you don't really need to do this, you know, there's a really nice playground. Which I think also became a point of focus because the idea, also the question kind of transformed into going beyond the formal limitations of playgrounds or public playgrounds, which are generally identical, and limit the child's actions and imagination, because a swing is made for swinging and the slide is made for sliding. So with that in mind, as I was leading towards the end of my engagement with the Portman at the time, the question changed, and the question developed into something more like, how can the permissive agents of play, which are adults, always, begin to perceive the public realm and value it through a child's perspective? It's a kind of, again, quite an ambitious question. But through dialogue with the education team and the Portman, Joe in particular, we thought maybe the best way to actually begin to have an attempt at this change of perspective or defamiliarize the adult perspective was to begin to embed this kind of activity and distribute it and make it maybe more, or exercise it, share it with the Portman's network, create certain kits, you know, basically these ropes and mesh and stuff, and produce some kind of instructional material somehow. And as I was documenting this process over the 10 weeks, I also was photographing with the intention of making some kind of film that would act maybe as an induction video somehow, something that may appeal to 3-year-olds and adults. So, and that is part of the material outcome of the project, which was these kits, which are kind of small backpacks where the parts are thrown in and children carry. There's a big backpack for an adult to carry the mesh, which is generally the heaviest piece, which is not very heavy, and the film which accompanies. And I'd like to show, the film is 8.5 minutes, but I'm going to show you a 2.5-minute version of it. And I will conclude on that. So I'm going to sit down so I can watch the screen. And thank you. And just like to give some credit for the film, it was made with Studio Odd, the animators, and a Japanese musician by the name of Manami Kakuda. Thank you.
So much, Bahbak. Thanks for sharing that with us. I'm going to welcome now Jasleen Kaur to the stage. Hi, Jasleen.
Hi. Such a beautiful film. We're going to start, well, I'm going to start the talk by feeding you. It felt like this, I'm halfway through a project at the Portman, and it felt like this recurring theme and this recurring word that kept coming up was nourishment. And so it felt quite fitting to make you guys some roti. They're definitely not gluten-free, but they are vegan. I'd like you to take one and rip it in half and share it with someone next to you, because I didn't make 120 this morning. I made 60. Yeah, let's give it a moment till you get some. There might be enough for one each. Okay, I'm going to make a start, so you're going to silently need to eat. Thank you. I'm going to read something that I wrote because I felt like there was, I guess it was me kind of digesting the project because I'm halfway through it, and I'd quite like to cover a lot of things that I don't think I'd be able to do without reading. So I am partway through a project working at the drop-in centre of the Portman, where my starting point was to use the micropolitics of cooking and eating together to engage in the macropolitics concerning the site and the community of the Portman Early Childhood Centre. Through some research days at the centre, speaking with staff and parents and Joe, I discovered that the centre is an ecosystem and the drop-in is a key link in the system, an initial point of contact that can support families in getting access to services, play spaces for children, ESOL classes, children and adult mental health clinic, breastfeeding clinic, domestic violence services. It's a lifeline to many living in the area and often of migrant communities. And the centre is at continual risk by government cuts. In my practice, food is used as something social and political. So it was interesting to learn that the food served to the children and staff in the nursery is provided by an external company via Westminster Council called Caterlink. Chef Clinton, originally from the West Indies, cooks food on site in the centre's kitchen. Ironically, applying for a job titled chef, he's in a job where he prepares set meals on set days of set months from set recipes provided by Caterlink. The Tuesday I met him, it was sweet and sour corn egg noodles, macaroni, cucumber and tomato slices, banana cake and custard. So, yeah, a bit bland, and reminded me of the one night of the week as a child that I had English dinner, which was usually lasagna or Findus crispy pancakes. Don't judge me. Clinton and the staff seemed unenthusiastic about the food. The council-regulated food system felt broken and with so much more potential, especially as on another visit on International Day, I was bombarded with plates upon plates of generously homemade biryanis, curries, baklava. This was not bland, neutral food. This was food from motherlands and mothers' hands. I tried to write down how many nationalities paraded down the catwalk in national dress. I counted 29, and I'm sure I missed quite a few. I learned about the community lunches of 2008, no longer due to cuts in funding, where parents would take it in turn to cook a meal and eat together. I learned about how many positives came out of this seemingly simple act. It was a cultural exchange from sharing recipes and ingredients, a space for adults and children to socialize and normalize food and eating for difficult eaters. It combated loneliness and depression. Most importantly, it provided a space to cook and a hot meal for those in need, as many of the users of the centre experience cramped or temporary living conditions, even homelessness. So this cooking was born out of the need for creating a safe space, a second home, for families travelling great distances to the centre due to changes in their temporary accommodation. Some were travelling from as far as Essex. The centre's in Edgware. Despite the temporary nature of this project and me being there, I wanted to use the project funding to restart those lunches. It might be worth mentioning that through the duration of the research and the project, I'm continually questioning the role of the artist in this context. Are we just putting a sticking plaster on a wound caused by state deficit? How can this way of working tackle the huge structural and societal injustices? It felt important to listen to these women, to cook, learn what recipes they hold dear to them, to create a group and a space for nourishment, knowledge exchange, slowness, and activism. I decided to focus on bread, and I became interested in its politics, how the healthiest options are the most expensive and therefore middle class, and what happens when citizens are deprived of the simplest of food sources. Bread riots have been occurring regularly since the mid-1980s. This year in Egypt, where bread is known as Aish, meaning life, protests were sparked due to cuts in bread subsidies, having a dramatic effect on the bread rations of the average citizen. And Jane Harrigan of SOAS talks about links between food inflation and the Arab Spring, saying, the food price spike was the final nail in the coffin for regimes that were failing to deliver on their side of the social contract. I grew up in a very white area of Glasgow. Outside of the house, I was Scottish, but when the door shut behind me, I was well and truly Indian, Punjabi, Sikh, Asian, British Asian, or something. I could smell Mum's sabji down the street on the walk back from school, and so could the whole playground when I took paratha and a jar for packed lunch. For me, cooking Punjabi food is a way of tending to my culture and my identity, be it dal roti for 500 in the Gurdwara or tarka beans for my white British husband, Ian. Raymond Williams talks about the early uses of the word culture as a noun of process, the tending of something, basically crops or animals, suggesting that culture is something we do, not look at through glass museum cabinets or from the upper stalls of a theatre. My culture is nourishing. I digest it. This knowledge is not printed in books. It's not absorbed through it is absorbed through seeing and doing over many years. It clings to me like the smell of masala does to my clothes and the stains of yellow turmeric does to my fingertips. Hadja, a project member, said to me in the kitchen one day at Portman, "We grew up in the kitchen. The kitchen is a place to have arguments, and it's the place to resolve them. There's always drama in my kitchen." So over 10 weeks, we set up a negotiated cooking class. Each week, we'd learn a new recipe from someone in the group and cooked it, adults and children together. By cooking and eating Rakayev, Harsha, Manakish, Batbut in their nursery, not just cookies and scones, I wanted to create a space for food that is not neutral, that is specific for their tongues. Seeing your identity reflected in places outside of the home is crucial. We'd make, cook, and eat from the shared platters and have a conversation, somehow all in 2 small hours. Tweaking the sessions each week, we eventually established a democratic space for everyone to participate, share, and be heard. And through the weeks, I found myself returning to 3 main questions. Can cooking and eating provide a space for listening? Can we build an internal system of nourishment and care? Can the micropolitics of cooking and eating at the Portman lead us into thinking about the macropolitics of the Portman as a site and the bodies that occupy that site? At the end of each session, we'd spend some time asking questions and talking and listening together, responding to what came up by spending time together as a group. And some of the things I asked over the weeks were, how do you hold on to or pass down your culture? How do you care and how are you cared for? What are our concerns? How do we remedy? How do we make change together as a group of women? The conversations over the week went from polite and reserved to honest and reflecting the reality of their lives. They told us how in the UK people eat alone, not as a community, how bread is almost religious and to share it is part of their culture and religion, about needing time to switch off from being a mother and be part of society, part of the world. Care was to be listened to be offered a cup of tea, having time to get a shower when home help comes once a week. How coming to Britain is like starting from zero. Of the racist slurs being spat on in the street and wearing hats instead of hijabs on Punish a Muslim Day. That women new to this country need support to rebuild themselves, to learn English, to have social conversations, not just in ESOL classes. That nursery is so expensive. Where are our taxis going? How do I go back to work? The Portman is a political space, and so are the bodies that fill it. They do not exist in a vacuum. There are so many questions that have come up in the project. All this stuff being said, who needs to hear it? When letters to MPs don't work, what can we do collectively? How does a project like this become sustainable when it has an end date and the centre is at risk? How do we self-organise? How can we make change together as a centre, as a community, as a neighbourhood? And so at the moment, I'm thinking of the next phase of the project, thinking about how this intimate, private, the sessions in the centre might go public, or how something invisible becomes visible, how our bodies collectively might take up public space as the government systematically works on the removal of them, how cooking can be an act of defiance and resilience as sustaining identities and knowledge, nourishing ourselves and our young. I'm going to end on a quote that I read on artist Rohana Zaman's Instagram that really stuck with me. And it's from the essay, Mothering as Revolutionary Praxis, and in which it quotes bell hooks. For those who dominate and oppress us benefit most when we have nothing to give our own, when they have so taken from us our dignity, our humanness, that we have nothing left, no home place where we can recover ourselves. I want to speak about the importance of home place in the midst of oppression and domination, of some place as a site of resistance and liberation struggle. Thank you.
Sit on the stage, Bahbak. And I'll sit on the stage. And Pat grab a seat next to Jasleen, maybe? 6. I don't know if I could go. This might be quite ungrateful. Wow. Well, thank you very much for all your presentations. They were incredible, and there's so much to think about and talk about from there, I think. I guess I wanted to start by giving Joe an opportunity to talk. Joe, as we mentioned before, is the head of the Portman Centre. And I guess I just wanted to open, Joe, just by asking you to talk through about your relationship with the local community.
Well, I'm usually full of words, but I have to say that these 3 presentations have taken me back as well and reminded me just what a lot of work we have to do. I think when we're talking about community, it's very difficult because it's such a disparate group of people you might call in your community. And who your community consists of depends very much on what you do, where you live, what colour you are, lots and lots of things, whether you've got young children, whether you've got teenagers. But the community in Church Street is hugely vibrant. It is a place where 52% of children are living in poverty, but it is also a very rich place in the people that join us for all the things we do at Portman and at the other places that people can go in Portman. It's a community that cares, and it's a community that wants to give. But it's also a community where there are women's refuges, there are communities who are using food banks. It's a community that have their children, their families have been moved well out of the centre of London because of rent caps, and who still come into London from, I think somebody mentioned Essex, in order to bring their children to school every day in Westminster. I love the community. I love its vibrancy, I love its challenge, and I love the love that there is for each other within the community of Portman. Is that what you wanted me to say?
It's amazing. Thank you so much, Joe. I guess I wanted to bring Pat into this conversation. You've not had a chance to speak yet. I know that when we spoke earlier, you were talking about how Changing Play, this programme, has engaged with some of the struggles that Joe's mentioned. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Okay, I'm an academic, so I better say something that sounds academic, I guess. When I was thinking about this sort of question, it struck me it's kind of helpful to put it in a longer history, really, and just think about kind of educational and care as a social institution. And, it's really a social institution which, I guess to quote the Italian Marxist philosopher Gramsci, is organic to a particular kind of class. And that was really summed up very well by Michael Gove a few years ago when he was talking about the new school curriculum, and he talked about there being a seamless corridor between Eton and Westminster. And that's an organic relationship. And I think, schools that serve communities other than that which goes to schools like Eton and their state school equivalents are always, in a sense, struggling against this kind of inorganic relationship. They're always struggling to actually make themselves part of the community. And that's a kind of historical issue, and that's been an historical struggle. And at various times, policy has been more or less favourable. And so when Ilya, we were talking earlier about Ilya in the 1970s, Ilya was very strongly committed to supporting schools to establish more organic relationships with their communities. But the policy situation that we have now is profoundly about the needs of the state and profoundly about the needs of central government and its needs to be seen to perform and to produce data of particular kinds, and it has a particular kind of logic of operating which strips out even further, I think, everything local and just makes it really, really difficult, I think, for schools and care centres, early childhood and other public services to actually establish those kind of connections. And I think that's actually why it's really important that other institutions like the Serpentine are able to kind of become partners in that process, I think, of working, as Jasleen suggested, I think, in a very resistant way to the kinds of locally eviscerating practices that are now just so much part and parcel of government that a lot of the time we don't even think about what's happening, I think.
Is that something that resonates with you, Joe? I saw you nodding vigorously.
Yes, I mean, there's nothing in that doesn't ring every bell in my body, really. And whilst the Portman is a vibrant and exciting place, we're threatened all the time. We're heading for a very, very substantial deficit. And sustainability is a real issue because we're not ticking the boxes that the government wants us to tick. Or at least I think they don't. Sometimes I think they do, and sometimes I think they don't. But we're not in the league tables of schools. So there's a real problem there, and a real problem for our families who go on to leaving us to go into other establishments where that care element is absolutely not there, because the drive is different. It's about what you teach, not how you teach or how you encourage children to be lovers of learning, and parents to be engaged in that process is very difficult within the context of the maintained primary and secondary sectors.
I know we talked a few weeks back about, is it Bold Beginnings? And about that was a new kind of policy or paper that was kind of putting even more pressure on you guys to kind of this idea of like schoolification, of pressing those values and ways of teaching and learning from primary school right into your space, and that was affecting a lot of your children.
I think what is affecting is parents. All parents want their children to be successful. It doesn't matter where you come from in the world, what your status is, what your income is. It really doesn't matter. Every parent wants their child to be successful. If they are constantly being told that the only way your child will be successful if they can do a phonics test at 4, that's what you'll go for, because that's your job as a parent. And it's quite difficult to go against that. And although we encourage people to be always thinking about what you can learn from just being with other children, what you can learn from projects, what you can learn from playing with the water, that the whole thing is about learning. The mantra from government does not include those things.
Okay, thanks for giving us some more insight into that. I guess I wanted to kind of bring you guys back in and ask about, it's a question for everybody really, but what do you think that artists can bring to this context? You kind of struggled with it in your presentations and thinking through, but do you have any thoughts?
I mean, I think at Portman, they have been a lifeline for staff as well as parents and children. That somebody comes in and allows us to think and to try things out. discourse has always been part of the culture of Portman. It's very, very important to us. We've never been defensive about what we do because we have a very strongly held understanding of what our pedagogy is. But what the artists have done is allow us to articulate that and really put that into what we do on a very daily basis. Portman is a sort of uncomfortable place to work if you want certainty. And what the artists have done is push us even a little bit further. And if you're brave, that's very exciting and very energizing and provides hugely rich opportunities for learning for the children we have.
Does anybody else want to chip in on that question?
I find it's such a difficult question. Yeah. I feel like, if I'm completely honest with myself, I haven't gotten to, and I don't know if I ever will or should get to a clear answer in this kind of practice of working as an artist in this kind of way. That perhaps there isn't a definitive answer ever. I was reading this interview between artist Amit Ogut, and I can't remember who the other person is he's actually in conversation with, but he talks about training the imagination is an ethical intervention, and he's talking about that in regards to working in the institution in the university, so it's a slightly different conversation, but still something oppressive. The institution is a place that is oppressive, and the government and the centre having this kind of oppressive government standard put upon it. And so, yeah, it chimed with me in terms of, and I guess being able to provoke and ask questions, and on a really basic level, bringing in money when things can't, and making things possible. I feel like that's something that really struck me when I was working with it, because we had a crazy turnout. Like sometimes when we were cooking, we'd have 70 people, and we had 2 hours to make this work, and it worked. I mean, it was difficult, but it worked. And we'd come back from it and think, why is this such a simple act, like just cooking together, baking it, eating it, having a conversation? Why is this so popular? And I guess it's about creating this space where people are heard and doing that again and again and again so that people are continuing to be heard. But perhaps another bit of it is that, services are being cut and what the centre can offer is being cut. And so bringing in people with money, I can't help but kind of get away from that really practical side of it as well.
Money is always welcome if anyone's got any.
I can give a very, very quick one. I think as a designer or an artist, when invited to such a place, I give myself the permission to break some habits that I see, just momentarily, kind of identify existing kind of habits within the place that I'm working in, and maybe momentarily through my work break those habits. But then I leave. But then I think then the question is, what kind of trace can you leave, and how can your impact or your project or your idea kind of live on? And I think that kind of brings the responsibility back to the organization or institution.
I was looking at sort of intelligent things to say before I came here, and I found I didn't say this, but it said that change is not hard, but the habit of moving back into grooves of convenience are very popular. And I think the great thing about the Serpentine is that they keep coming back. They keep reminding us. They keep stopping us to go back into those grooves of convenience. And that's been fantastic. And in a staff who are really concerned about the levels of cuts, it has been a real excitement. And entering into discourse and dialogue and being listened to has been wonderful as well. They are But they're great people as well as artists, I have to say.
Can I just add to that? But I always felt like I left the label artist at the door. Like, it doesn't have a place. It doesn't matter. And actually, at least I can only speak for the breads and the cooking. There was no understanding of who was in charge, who was the artist, who was from the Serpentine, who wasn't. Like that, those kinds of conversations didn't really take place. So.
Yeah, I think there should always be a role for co-construction of places and ideas with the families, with the children, with visitors. There isn't one Portman. It changes all the time, and it becomes something different. But at its heart, and I was very interested in this, there is care. I think care is fundamental to what we do. That doesn't mean we don't challenge families, but we do care for them as well as challenge.
I felt like I just wanted to challenge something in some ways. I think these kinds of collaborations obviously open up a space which is super productive. It's like very clear, it's obvious, it's very material. There's a lot of care and excitement, and I think all these things are happening. But alongside that, I can't help but think that we're sort of a stopgap in some ways, or that, we have to be fighting the other fight too, which is there are cuts. They're having really profound effects on these spaces, on people's lives, and to just, on the one hand, be able to act and function within these kind of liminal spaces is really important to sort of exist in these cracks under these kind of oppressive umbrellas, institutional umbrellas, state umbrellas, and being able to sort of funnel your little way through those is really interesting. But at the same time, we need to make sure that we are not the only thing that we're relying on to make these things happen, because these things change constantly. There's no stability in them. And maybe, ways to visibilize care, I think, are really important. So ways to make these problems like really visible are to me really core, instead of just constantly relying on these liminal spaces to exist, because sometimes they don't.
Yeah. Do you want to chip in there?
Well, I guess English is a really unhelpful language in a whole lot of ways, and there are this kind of separation of care from other aspects of, say, for example, education or just living, is actually really unhelpful, I think. It's helpful in some ways, but it's also unhelpful in the way it's kind of institutionalised, and also in the way it kind of permeates people's sort of thinking. And there are a lot of other cultures where, raising children isn't divided into sets of boxes. It's basically raising children. Where I come from in Australia, in the 700 odd kind of indigenous languages, there are words which basically mean kind of upbringing, and that applies to the myriads of ways in which children become adults and learn what it is they need to know. And I think interestingly, I think it's only actually in early childhood where people have really wrestled with the kind of tension that there is in the English language between care and learning. And, I think in a lot of ways there's obviously a kind of an ethical dimension to a question of care, but when we're actually looking at the institution, it's not that helpful, because we have these kind of separations of carers from teachers, for instance, which with different pay levels, which is all built on this kind of post-Enlightenment view of how it is you actually bring people up. And I think one of the things that happens when some artists and others who aren't kind of necessarily in the same sort of mindset come into educational settings in particular, is that they don't actually necessarily operate with that same kind of bifurcation, and it's much more about, this is about how you are in the world, this is actually how, you're curious, you're whatever, and it's not about play, and it's not about learning, it's not about care, it's the totality that's important. And I think, you know, that is very resonant, I think, with early childhood educators, and it's also very part of that process of resisting the kind of, you know, schoolification of the world, basically, and this kind of logic of counting and measuring and ticking off that we have.
I think that's true, and I think it started with the Sure Start, which was a wonderful idea. Well, not a new idea, but it was a good starting point. But what it confused people was the difference between getting women back to work and childcare, and the difference of, I mean, when I use care, I avoid putting child in front of it, because as soon as you put childcare in front of it, it has a very different connotation. It's much more about the economics of work than it is about children and the care for the family. When I was training as a teacher, I was training to work in education and childcare. What we hear now is the education bit removed, and the political discourse is about childcare. And that changes hugely the politics of what I and many other people do.
I'm very conscious that we could continue to talk all day, and I'm very happy here on the stage. I'd be happy to do that. But I want to just give a moment or two to the audience to kind of come back with any questions you might have had from the presentations or the conversation. Oh.
About where we are, because listening to what you're saying and remembering a history has come very strongly on me, and I can't shut up. So this is Red Lion Square. I was at the Battle of Red Lion Square against the fascists in 1974. I say this in the context of the glorification of Enoch Powell that has just taken place, because he was glorified without any reference to the extremely strong anti-fascist movement that developed throughout the 70s and early 80s. I feel very passionately about that. I also feel very passionately about this place, because Red Lion Square is also the space of Conway Hall, which is an extraordinarily progressive, long-standing space. And so standing here today, being here today, with what you've just said, talking about, and remembering the Battle of Red Lion Square, and of course all the Battle of Grosvenor Square, all the ways in which we fought for democracy and fought for the language to express it, and debated and challenged the use of words, which is what you've been talking about, the use of the word education, the use of the word care. I just wanted to say that, and I just feel we're in a very electric space. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Frances. Thank you. Oh, look at that. Thanks. Is there anybody else who has any thoughts or questions? Oh, hello, sorry.
Hi. I just wanted to make an observation about what I perceive to be what the artists have done. And that is that despite the cuts and the sort of victim status in which many people find themselves, the artists seem to have come in and found ways for people and communities to realize their own powers. And they've come in with innovative ways to empower people themselves. And in your case, it was a simple, to me, absolutely ingenious way of realizing that people have their own creativity in the cooking that they have, and that just to follow a normal school dinner curriculum was boring and wasn't addressing the needs of the community of the children that were there. So it's just simply a way of thinking outside the box, and through that cooking, you've given those children and those communities a way of actually empowering themselves and feeling that what they have is special. And I thought in your play, children, we say, what are the rights to the city? But children aren't perceived as having rights. They are regarded as incompetent, both politically and legally speaking. And what you've done is shown children that they can use the spaces that they have around them, that they can use those spaces in their own ways and own their own spaces. They don't have to go and play on a swing in a playground. And I think that that's a very powerful way of empowering children and liberating children. Whether or not in the long term we can, I don't know about that space that you're working in, whether it's actually open to children or do they actually have to go with you in groups of 3. But I know with my own work in schools, there's so many rules about what you can and can't do with children and risk assessments. I'm amazed that you were even allowed to take children and let them walk along a plank of wood. I was once unable to take my own toddler to the toilet on a school trip because I hadn't been CR whatever checked. So, I think what both of you have done is working with, getting the institutions themselves and the people who are working with children to think about different ways in which they can use what they have. And that's hugely empowering. So, thank you.
I think there's a culture at Portman that allows us to take risks. We're slightly anarchic. We want to give children experiences, and who could turn down Parsons House with all that stuff, nothing there, and the children creating something and having this discourse. And the film goes on to look at parents, because Bahbak then took a group of parents up there with their children.
Yeah.
And a wonderful thing, there's a photograph of some children in a shopping trolley, because always shopping trolleys left abandoned in these places. And one of the mothers being reminded that that's what she did as a child. And that discourse that started then about what her memories of being a child in an urban setting and what they used to do. So, I think you have to give people permission as a leader, and you cross your fingers quite often, and you hope you don't find yourself on the front of the Mail. But I think as educators we need to take risks with children. It's not reasonable. They have a right, I think, to those experiences.
Maybe that is unless anybody has any final thoughts that they wanted to share. Pat, you're looking at me. Do you want to? Please feel free.
Well, I really just wanted to say that I think that, and my colleague Anton and I are the evaluators of this project, and as evaluators, that you always come in with a headset that goes, well, this was what was done, what were the set of outputs, what actually happened as a result, what did this project do? And I think that's one kind of question that you can ask. But I think the other question that you can ask is, what are people doing when they're doing this? So what's this practice that's going on that the Serpentine and the artists in Serial have actually done? And it seems to me that what's happened is that, and what is done is that children and families and artists together are engaged in producing meanings and producing culture. And that's actually what's important. That's probably more important than any other kind of thing that Anton and I might say about, the kids expanded their vocabulary and they, which of course we can say, but, in terms of actually thinking about culture as a right and cultures in cities, then, that's the right that's actually being exercised and produced through this program, it seems to me. And so that's really just what I wanted to say. We will write that in our report, of course.
Well, thank you. Well, thanks for all of you for being involved in this conversation. I'd just like to say a big thank you and a round of applause.